This is section 221. We're going to take a look at absolute value equations. So we're going to be able to solve absolute value equations. Now there's a few ways to describe what is meant by the absolute value of x, of any real number x. And there's a few scenarios that we can kind of look at. The first means if you have the absolute value, it means what is the distance from 0. So the absolute value of -5, we're saying what's the distance from -5 to 0? Well, that's 5. Or if I said the absolute value +5, what's the distance from 0 to +5? That's 5. That is one of the reasons why anything inside of an absolute value becomes positive, is because we're looking for the distance, not necessarily some sort of subjective direction in the negative or in the positive. And another way we can look at it is the square root. The absolute value of 5 is the square root of 5 squared, just because no matter what's inside, it could be positive or negative, you're going to end up getting a positive. Now, graphically, and we're going to look at this a little bit later, we can break our absolute value equation into a piecewise function, where the absolute value of x is -x, which is that part where x is less than 0, and then where it's x, which is that part where x is greater than or equal to 0, and that's where you get that V shape. Now here's a few rules, but we're not going to really be manipulating them too much with absolute value. The big one is going to be this property down here, and we're going to use that to be able to solve them. So solving each of these, the x is inside the absolute value. Now a strategy typically is to isolate and get the absolute value part by itself. So if there's anything outside the absolute value, anything over here, right, we want to isolate and get the absolute value by itself. Once you do that and applying the property, if you read the property, it says the absolute value of x, if it equals a number, you assume that x is positive and negative. You assume what's inside the absolute value, that's what's inside the absolute value, is positive, negative. So the algebraic technique for us to get rid of an absolute value is we write plus or minus, and we can turn it into that statement there. So that absolute value means that plus or minus. So then this just breaks into two different equations. We have the positive version, and then we have the negative version. That plus or minus just means we have two separate equations. So distribute the positive, well, it's just the same. Add 1. Divide by 3. Yes, it's okay that our answer is a fraction. On the other one, distribute the negative. Subtract 1. Divide by -3. And our answer is -5/3. So to solve an absolute value equation, what we need to do is just get rid of the absolute value part, and to do that, you just apply the property. You change it into a plus or minus. Let's look at another one. So I want to isolate the absolute value. So I'm going to subtract 3 on both sides. And now notice there's still that negative in front, so divide everything by a negative. Now, applying the property, we're getting rid of that absolute value by having that plus or minus in front. And so now I can break it into the two versions. X plus 1 equals 2, and negative x plus 1 equals 2. Yeah, there's a plus in front, but remember, if we distribute the positive, it turns to be the same thing. Subtract 1, distribute the negative, add 1, divide by negative. So you get x equals -3 and x equals +1. Now this can happen in any way, shape, or form. Now I know what we're thinking, oh man, it equals x. It doesn't just equal a number. That's okay. Try and isolate the absolute value. Apply the property. And so now I get positive x minus 2 equals x minus 1. And I get negative x minus 2 equals x minus 1. Well, if I subtract the x on both sides, x's disappear. I can't use it anymore. But for this one, distributing the negative, add x, add 1, divide by 2, and so that's our answer, 3/2. Now, what happens if an absolute value equals another absolute value? We just have to remember it. The way that we get rid of the absolute value when you have an absolute value equaling another absolute value is it's a positive versus a positive and a positive versus a negative. So what I mean by that, and we think of this as this is what's inside the absolute value. So positive x equals a positive x minus 3, which is just the same as x equals x minus 3. And then a positive equals a negative. And then you just solve each of those. So if I subtract x on both sides, cancels out, nothing happens. For this one, you get x, distribute the negative, add x, divide by 2, and you get x equals 3/2. So what did we learn today? We learned how to solve absolute value equations. Now, what are the different ways that you can express an absolute value? We can express it as a piecewise function, right? So the f of x equals, and then we have negative x where x is less than 0, and then x is greater than or equal to 0. And then we could also break it apart into that plus or minus when we go to solve the equation. What happens to when my absolute value equals a negative number? So let's think about that. Can the absolute value of something equal a negative number? What can I plug in that makes it negative? Well, it can't. So if you ever have an absolute value equaling a negative number, now remember the absolute value has to be by itself, you're going to get no solution. This does conclude our lesson. If you have any other questions, please leave them in the comments.